forward to the fifth one. And this cluster of presentations focuses on in regional integration, regional cooperation, and conflicts. And I think, Shireen, I am not in the agenda formally, but since you asked me to kick the start the event, I would say I embrace the responsibility, but I'm, I think I don't know even the person who will be chairing the various sessions. So
I can come in and help. Welcome to everybody to day 2 of the policy conference on conflict, post-conflict and reconstruction in conflict-afflicted Arab countries. We had 2 very interesting sessions yesterday. Today we'll have 2 more sessions and the closing. The third session is going to be dealing with regional cooperation and conflict in MENA. We are expecting Dr. Seedlow to log in any moment, and she'll be taking on the moderation of the session. Our speaker is Dr. Ahmed Ghanem, and he will be talking to us about economic interdependency and conflict in MENA. And then our lead commentator for this session is Dr. Lahsan Ashey with the IMF. He'll be giving us some initial reactions to Dr. Ghanem's presentation, followed by space for Q&A based on the input we get in the Q&A or raising your hand for the floor. With that, I give the floor to Dr. Ahmed Ghanem for the first presentation.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, all of you, for being here. And before I start, I just want to thank first a number of colleagues and friends who actually, my presentation is built upon what the work they did, including Khalid Sekat, including Mohammed Marwani, including Ibrahim Saif, including Katarina Seedlow. And they all prepared the material, the brief for what I'm going to say. Also, I would just like to thank Asma Izzat and Dina Mandoor for reviewing the synthesis paper that I prepared based on the work of the 4 colleagues and their colleagues as well, because Saif had Khouri with him and Marwani had as well Asik with her, and Ibrahim Saif had somebody else, and so on. The topic that I'm going to discuss today is the economic interdependence and conflict management in MENA. So the whole speech will be about 3 main issues. What does the literature tell us? And is MENA special? And finally, the issue of what did the research so far done by my 4 colleagues that I mentioned reach so far. So that's the names of the 4 papers that the presentation is based upon, which is, as I mentioned, Asik and Marwani, Saif and Khouri, Sekat alone, and Katarina Seedlow alone. Can we please use the other? Yeah, just go ahead with the slide. The slide after, please. Yes. First, what does the literature tell us? The literature simply boils down to 2 main schools of thought. One of them is called the liberals, and the one is called the realists. The liberals are more or less believe that the more economic interdependence is there, the less likelihood of conflict to arise. Whereas the realists just say the opposite. Now here we have a big major problem, because as you think, it might very simple that, okay, the relationship between economic interdependence and conflict management is easy. But let's start first, but what do we mean by economic interdependence? And here the literature is very much dispersed over many, many issues that need to be included. For example, should we include only trade as a proxy for economic interdependence, or should we include as well the financial transactions, including FDI and hot money and other terms of financial transfers that happen between countries, or should we include trade and services? And even if we confine to trade alone, should we be focusing on regional or bilateral or multilateral trade? The same applies for what do we mean by conflict management? Do we mean really conflict management, or do we mean prevention or escalation or solving? So whenever you dig in the details, the devil is in the details regarding identifying what are the two main variables that we are measuring. And that's a major issue, because it might be the case that, okay, economic interdependence measured by trade only affects conflict management, but it does not affect conflict solving, and so on and so forth. The reviewed papers help in outlining such factors that serve as conditions supporting the validity of each stream of thought. We followed, or my colleagues followed, the narrow definition, more or less, of economic interdependence, which was mainly confined to merchandise trade flows. Yet the paper of Marwani and Asik actually included as well a little bit of FDI and portfolio investments, but very rarely in the literature in general, and not definitely in the papers that have been taken in this ERF project, took services trade into account. Maybe simply because data is not readily available on bilateral services trade between Arab countries or MENA countries in this regard. And mainly, simply, even if you capture services trade, then you'll definitely lose a huge bulk of some of the sectors that nobody's reporting on bilateral basis. The inclusion of several variables that affect the relationship between the two variables added to the complexity of the issue. So if you look at the literature, which was mainly prepared by a very good literature review paper prepared by Katarina Zedlo, there are very important aspects that are very specific to MENA, which affects such relationship in general, including the political regime, the issue of whether we are democracy or autocracy, and the nature of the political regime definitely affects such kind of relationship. The asymmetry relationship between the economic partners, whether you have a hegemonic power or countries are all of the same power, the nature of the trade scheme adopted, and the presence and nature of preferential trade agreements, and whether they are shallow or deep in nature. So such kind of control variables, especially the democracy versus autocracy issue, plays a very important role in the literature, and definitely that's an issue included in the MENA context. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. Then we move to the issue of whether is MENA special or not. If you look at the two issues separately, then definitely MENA pops out as one of the second region in the world regarding the amount of armed conflict over the last 3 decades. We're only surpassed by sub-Saharan Africa in this regard. But even the issue of definitely what's happening, countries like Iraq, for example, is among the leading countries in this regard whenever you go to any database regarding conflict. But again, here we have a problem, because whenever this is the case in databases, then the calculation of what we mean by conflict is definitely an issue that should be considered. And there is another ERF project which dealt with the costs of conflict. So normally it is calculated as the number of incidents or the number of injuries and the number of dead people. But yet there are other hidden costs that are not calculated in the databases, and that's not an issue for this presentation, but just to tell you the complexity. But MENA in general is among the highest regions in the world that is heavily affected definitely by the magnitude of conflicts when compared worldwide. The other, again, characteristic of MENA that's well known for all the people is that we have a very low share of intra-regional trade in the region. We definitely, this is an issue for trade people who always comment on, including Lahsan, for example, and Tariq and other people from ERF, that we, and Ra'id Safadi, that we definitely have a low regional, intra-regional trade. And some of the people whenever they use gravity model, they identify that's compared to the characteristics of MENA, it's not very low if we remove oil and so on and so forth. So the debate on it is highly there, but yet we remain with a very low intra-regional trade in absolute terms. Definitely as well, we are recognized by having a low democracy rate. Whenever it comes to the type of conflicts that MENA has passed by, I think we have all the types of conflict, whether we're talking about interstate or intrastate, whether we're talking about armed conflict, whether we're talking about between the countries in MENA or countries in MENA and other countries outside MENA. So we have all the types of conflicts that can happen are already there in the MENA. So to start with, if we're going to test the hypothesis, the economic interdependence in MENA is considered low, even without there are any conflicts, an issue that should be recognized to start with. The relationship between economic interdependence and conflict prevention and management seems highly contingent on a number of other variables in MENA. So here comes the role of the control variables that we mentioned, including the democracy, including the hegemonic power, including other aspects that act as control variables. And in this case as well, we have a very unique case where the MENA, you cannot talk about it easily, which comes in the papers afterwards, but you have to divide it into sub-regional regions. For example, the Gulf area seems to pop out as having higher economic interdependence among its members, and hence the possibility of a rising conflict is less compared to the rest of the MENA. So again, even within MENA, which is already having a lot of so many control variables, whenever it comes to sub-regional level, then we have other differentiation that should be taken into account when we're talking about MENA. Can we please run the other slide? Yeah. And then the papers, the four that were included in this ERF project, the first one was Saif and Khouri, who actually focused on the role of institutions and the inefficiency or efficiency of the regional institutions. They mainly focused on the League of Arab States and the mechanism of handling the PAFTA or the Pan-Arab Free Trade Area. And they identified that this is an issue that should be considered, that institutions that work on the regional level, I'm not talking about institutions on the domestic or local level, but on the regional level to a high extent are very weak in terms of managing the regional trade agreement and in terms as well of managing the conflict that can arise either from trade or from outside of trade in the region. So that's an issue that is definitely a characteristic of MENA. Sikat, actually, we had two papers, that's Sikat and Marwani. Sikat focused on the impact of different forms of conflict on trade. And Marwani did the other thing, which is the impact of trade on conflict. So Sikat found out, he actually studied the issue from 1971 to 2014, and he found only out of the different types of trade that only commercial sanctions, which are input restrictions, and interstate wars are significant in terms of having negative effect on trade. So whatever conflict is there does not affect trade. So that's an issue. So it's a minor impact of conflicts on trade, and not all types of conflicts, but rather narrowed down to only commercial sanctions and interstate wars. And definitely this is not a significant result that we can say that it's a significant characteristic of MENA in this regard. So the bottom line that Sikat reached is that the impact of conflict on trade is rather minimum, and it appears only in two types. Can we, next slide, please? Marwani found that trade is not disrupted after a conflict episode in MENA. So he studied the impact of conflict on trade and not the other thing. And they found that in line with the realists that both bilateral and multilateral trade induce conflict in MENA, with the exception of the case of rich oil export countries. That's the case of Gulf that I've been talking about, that they are not affected even by this effect, as I mentioned, that they generalized, with the exception of the Gulf countries, whose bilateral trade links are associated with lower probability of militarized conflict. That's what they reached. Whether this is the case that they are highly interdependent on each other economically, or it's because of the hegemonic power, or because of other reasons, that was not very clear, but it's an issue that we should consider, whether it's arising from the type of the regime or arising to the natural trading and geographical relations between them, but that's an issue that is important. They also found that the existing PTAs, preferential trade agreements, have minimal effect on deterring conflicts, simply as they are mainly shallow agreements. So again, they are referring to the lower effect of trade on conflicts, reasoning that because of the issue of shallowness versus deepness. So as you all probably know, all the PTAs in this region are shallow, so they are actually do not have a deep aspect and more rooted in rules and regulations on the domestic level. They found no significant statistical relationship between FDI flows and conflict in general, though FDI flows seem to be more deterrent for conflict than inflows. So again, just a surprising result that despite the fact that we have two obvious things in this region, which is low intra-regional trade and high conflict probability, we find that the relationship between the two, based on Sikat and Marwani, is not that significant. And whenever it's significant, it is significant in only narrow and identified cases. Can we please next slide? So what do we learn out of this exercise? Trying to synthesize what can we reach out of this thing that is very general and that it depends on so many control variables, and that's a kind of suggestions for future research agenda that we need. Whenever we're studying this, again, we need to be more confined and identify what do we mean by the definition of conflict and economic interdependence. By the way, such kind of lessons learned, they are not only for MENA or for ERF in general to take into account, but rather based on the literature review that Katerina provided and based on what we've seen. The definition is very important. We have broader definitions, but when it comes to narrow definitions which affect what we do, it's not there. So the definitions are extremely important. And as I said, whether we're talking about conflict management or prevention or what do we mean by economic interdependence? And Ibrahim already wrote on this issue before, and he used the paper which I used as a background, which was very useful. But again, such issues are extremely important. The role of control variables, it's an issue that needs to be considered in MENA, simply because we lack, the countries are identified as not democratic, the issue of institutions. So those are the main issues that can be used either as control variables or whenever we're providing some policy implications, how to make sure that economic interdependence does not affect or affects positively conflict. Then it's not in the relationship between the two, but rather in the institutions and the democratic regimes, for example. The role of institutions on the regional level. So far, since I started studying economics, we've been always taught that the League of the Arab States, and when we compare it, for example, to the system in the EU and the European Commission, we found the difference that the European Commission acts as a supranational power, whereas the League of Arab States acts as secretary and acts as an interstate organization. So it doesn't have the power to act with strong actions to solidify and intensify the institutions. And we find this in the trade arena in terms of the lack of standards and harmonization, in the lack of a dispute settlement mechanism and things like that. So the role of institutions seems to be extremely important, yet it seems to be missing completely in the equation of whether MENA is special or not. Finally, the role of the hegemonic power or the lack thereof. I mean, okay, when we look at the case of any of the regional trade agreements that are there in the world, we find that this plays a very important role in making the agreement works, which is the case, not the case in the MENA region. We do not have a hegemonic power that is able to lead the countries to do something. We don't have something like the US or Germany in the EU, or a leading partner that can act like South Africa among its acting the neighbors among them. In the case of the Arab world, this issue is not there. Sometimes this role has been played by Egypt, but not in the trade. Sometimes it has been played by Saudi Arabia, but not in the trade. So when it comes to trade, it's not there. When it comes to conflict management, then it is not necessarily the same country that plays the role all the time. Sometimes Oman plays this role, sometimes United Arab Emirates play this role. So we're not sure of whether the presence of it or the lack of it is actually playing a role, but we know from the literature that this is a variable that is important in this kind of equation between economic interdependence and conflict management. The last thing, can we please move the slide? This is the other thing. I will just hint to it. I will not deal with it because it was another synthesis paper on the cost of conflict. And whenever I want to mention here an issue, I won't use the slide. I just talk for 1 minute. The other report, and that's the synergy between the two reports, is very important. Deals with actually, I would say, the hidden costs of conflict. So, which is another aspect that should be taken into consideration. So whenever, for example, there are refugees in one of the countries, they do not only affect the country that they immigrate from, but they affect definitely the health, the education, the pressure on many of the public services in the countries they immigrate to, which means that there are hidden costs that should be taken into account. This is one issue that is just cross the border, not only in the country that suffers from the conflict, but other neighboring countries suffer from. And the other issue that should be taken into account is the issue of time. So the impact of the conflict, whenever we measure it with the traditional norms using FDI flows or trade flows or whatever, does not take into account the impact in the long run, which can be on the human capital and other aspects that normally we as people in the trade policy or people in the conflict management do not look at in the long run, and how it affects the dietary system, how it affects the health conditions, how it affects all such aspects. So in a nutshell, it's a very useful exercise to me to learn more, but I ended up from this synthesis report that there are so many variables that should be taken into account, and the level of knowledge we know in this field is definitely less than the optimal or that we can reach if we consider all what I mentioned in the synthesis report that has been done by others, and I just came out with some of the lessons learned. Thank you so much. I cannot hear you, Shireen.
Oops. Thank you so much, Dr. Ghonim. I'm actually, now we've got Dr. Sidlo with us, so the floor is back with our moderator for the session, and she will take it from there. Thanks ever so much.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and my apologies for being late. I had some troubles with my internet connection, but I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy that I managed to actually listen to most of the presentation, which was very interesting indeed. So now we are going to move to the feedback to the papers, to the presentation, which will be done by the lead commentator. And I do apologize for mispronunciation of your surname in advance, Mr. Lassen Aki, or Aki, from who is a deputy director at the International Monetary Fund. So he actually has a very long and vast experience working in the Middle East, working on the fiscal policies, labor market issues, informal economy, market efficiency, but also development and institutional economics in the MENA region. So using his very vast experience, he will be now, during the next maximum of 15 minutes, I would ask, provide his feedback to the paper that was presented by Dr. Zonaim. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Katarina. I would like first to start with the disclaimer. So I'm here on behalf of myself and not representing any institution. Thank you for the ARF management and to my dear friend Ahmed for inviting me to comment on this synthesis report of one important component of the larger research project that was coordinated by ERF fellows, and that reflects that ERF is eager to engage in topics and areas that matter for the region. And conflict is indeed one of the key defining features of the region. Even when this topic is not easy to handle, either in terms of the framework or the availability of data and the complexity of the issues as indicated by Ahmed towards the end of his presentation. So this is a crucial research on a timely and highly relevant issue. Today everybody is talking about conflict between Ukraine and Russia, for instance, and also conflicts in other parts of the world and their implication on human capital, on food security, on energy security, and other issues. So certainly conflict is one of the key issues that economists need to address. And the relationship with the economic interdependence in whatever way this economic interdependence is defined. So the project was conducted under the leadership of Ahmed, with contribution of a team of excellent ERF researchers with solid experience and rich background both in academia and policy making. So I'm referring here to Ahmed himself, Ibrahim Saif, Marwani, Khalid Sakat, Guinness, Rani, Khoury, and Katarina. So this is a very important achievement. The outcome of the project, 4 ERF working papers that contributes to the literature for the region and beyond, with valuable finding that make sense of a large body of the literature. The Katarina's paper, and also by focusing on institution and the role of the institution in promoting or handling trade. So the case of the Arab League and its minimal impact, I would say, on promoting regional trade in the region. And also 2 empirical papers that investigate the econometric relationship between various forms and scales of conflict, so sanctions and conflict, wars, etc., and their impact on economic interdependence, so either merchandise trade only or trade in goods and services, or by also including FDI. And in the econometric papers, the period was relatively large, since it starts in the 70s and through the 2014, I think, in one of the papers. So this is a very rich report, and of course I will not be able to in 15 minutes to discuss and appreciate all the finding, and here, to be honest, I only had time to skim through the papers given the tight time frame. So instead, I will suggest a few comments, a few questions that might probably help in structuring the research in a way that in a sense would make it more digestible. Of course, the presentation by Ahmed, as always, is much more digestible than the PowerPoint because it's very condensed. But these are suggestions to just highlight some of the findings and put them in context and package them in a way that easy to understand, and also to also provide some policy messages, both for researchers and also for other stakeholders interested in the issue. So the framework in general, as Ahmed mentions, is the relationship between economic interdependence and the impact of conflict in a broader sense. And then there is the mediation or mediating factor is political context or institutions and other factors like the nature of trade agreements. So we try to see how these two blocks, economic interdependence and conflict, relate to each other, and making control variables essentially political context and institutional factors in addition to other factors. The conclusion are interesting, sometimes intriguing, because the impact of conflict, as would one expect, was not always playing a major role, and so there are questions about what are then the key factors that explain the low level of trade, or why the countries in the region are not achieving the potential level of trade that is predicted by some of the model, like gravity models and others. So the relevance of thinking about this relationship between conflict and trade, if at the end of the research, or I would say at this step of the research, because I think that the future research is needed to refine the finding in order to understand why is it that the conflict or some forms of conflict are not playing a major role. As I said, I have here 4 comments, just comments. Maybe they reflect more the fact that I haven't had the enough time to read all the papers, but also some points are suggestions. So the question is what were the initial hypotheses? I don't see in this presentation the what was expected. What are we looking for exactly? Are we looking for the fact that conflict will play a major role, and we ended up finding something that corroborate or does not corroborate the expectation? And then if we can explain why the regional trade is not performing at the level it should be. So this is my first comment. The second comment is it would be great if we highlight how the 4 working papers relate to each other. Do they address the same question from different perspectives, or did they address different questions? This was not, at least in the presentation, clear to me. More specifically, how the paper, for instance, on the literature review guided or structures the rest of the papers. How the results of the 2 economic papers corroborate or contradict each other, are any methodological caveats that need to be investigated further? Ahmed, you mentioned towards the end some caveats, but to me they are in their general form. one would expect something more specific. My third comment is it would be nice to emphasize how the project finding or conclusion relate to the existing literature, either on the region or outside. So the finding that conflict is not so important, was it something that has already been mentioned in the literature, or is it something new? And what are the lessons for future research? And finally, my last comment is given the richness of the research and the diversity of perspective, I would suggest to highlight some key policy messages. So in terms of policy making, what would one take from this research for the government, for civil society, for international organization involved in mediating conflicts or addressing conflicts? Also for the private sector, what involved in trade, what would be the lessons? How the private sector can, for instance, play a role in mitigating or preventing or addressing some of the issues like sanctions and other things. And in that sense, do all types of conflict matter the same way or not? Ahmed, you mentioned that some of the conflicts have a different impact. So one would like to understand how and why. And finally, do the implications are similar or differentiated? So you mentioned that, for instance, Gulf countries behave differently. Is it something related to income level? Is it something related to history? Is it something related to the political regime? Just some hints on the reasons or the explanations on why. And one aspect that has not been addressed but also could be interesting, you mentioned trade, FDI. The other aspect is migration, because we have also important migration flows from in the region, especially from non-oil countries to oil countries. One would also like to see if migration flows behave the same way like trade and FDI, or differently. So this could be a potential research for the future. So I would like to thank you again, Ahmed, for giving me this opportunity to read this nice papers and comment on your paper. And thank you also for the organizing committee for inviting me to contribute to this policy conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hassan, for all this feedback and the questions. Before I open the floor to questions from the audience, I would like to give Ahmed an opportunity to maybe answer or relate to some facts that you provided. In the meantime, if you can think about some questions or comments yourself, please just raise your hand or type the question in the Q&A box, in the chat box, and after Ahmed's response to the lead commentator, we'll be able to open the floor for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharina, and thank you, Lahsan, for those insightful comments. I just want to make sure first, please, that if you can kindly send me such comments to have to include them in the final round of submitting the paper. That would be highly appreciated. If you're not sending to ERF, please send it to me, even with your handwriting on WhatsApp or whatever. Regarding your comments, I'll just reply back. What was the relationship between the different papers, to put them into bullet points? The relationship between the different papers was based on me acting as a principal investigator, and definitely having gone through the literature, what I felt is that, what are we looking at? The first two main variables, if we're talking about economic interdependence and conflict management, who's the independent and who's the dependent variable? So the idea came that we need to check both way type of relationship. And hence there was a paper on the impact of trade as a proxy for interdependence on conflict, and there was a paper of the impact of conflict on trade. The other thing is that we need a background, a kind of a setup, a kind of a framework to start from. And here comes the paper of the literature background, which was very useful in identifying the things. And as this replies to one of your comments, how they relate, I will come to it. The fourth paper, which is institutions. Given the fact that we're talking about the relationship and the complexity of it, and having a view on the literature, institutions do play a very important role, and hence, especially the regional ones. So in that sense, there was the idea of having a paper on institutions. The issue was as well confined. We could have had more papers, but again, that's a project, and we had to identify 4 papers, and that was the idea. That's the priorities I've seen that they are important to be included. The literature paper actually acted as I said, a framework where we can always refer to in the synthesis paper. What does the literature all over the world tell us, whether on theoretical or empirical basis? And in that sense, it gave a very good background on what do the guidelines of how to go through, and whether MENA is reflecting what is said in the literature, or it has, as we always say, a specificity that this region is different due to the oil, due to whatever reason is, it has. So again, that was the idea, to have a benchmark to measure to. And the relationship, the third point is the relationship between this paper, the literature review paper, and what we reached. Actually, it ended up that we have to study more stuff, which was actually identified from the literature review, that the papers tackle the issue as they are asked to. But again, we ended up that no significant impact is there, both sides. So maybe the missing aspects, like the control variables as democracy, as institutions, do fill this gap. And that's what that came in the lessons learned that I identified. The policy making issue is definitely coming to the point of the control variables, that maybe policymakers should focus more on institutions, on enhancing democracy. Those are the lessons that I can tell. But again, they remain weak in that sense, simply because there is no definite answers that those are the variables that affect. We're just suggesting that those are the variables that might not, when we focus on, they might have a different result. That when we narrowly define what we mean by economic interdependence, when we include services trade, when we include FDIs, when we focus on what kind of conflict, we might have a different answer. You're right about migration flows. Part of them is captured from services, but definitely it's an issue that should be included. I fully agree with that. For the private sector role to be played, I still, maybe I didn't catch enough what you want to say, but I see no role for the private sector to be said here, simply because none of the results implied that okay, trade definitely reduces conflict, and hence private sector should lobby for this or whatever, or that on the other hand, conflict affected trade. So to identify the role of the private sector in this regard, I feel it is a little bit might be invoked rather than coming naturally out of what we reached in this synthesis paper.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ahmed, for responding to the feedback from the lead commentator. We already actually have 3 questions and comments in the chat. So I will perhaps start the Q&A session by reading out those to you. And in the meantime, I encourage everyone to either type the questions in the chat or raise your hand if you would like to speak. So the first comment we received is a question regarding why Bahrain was not included among the MENA countries that we looked at in the study. The second one is a question of the impact of the black market in trade between the MENA countries in the MENA region. And the third one is a comment saying that it could be especially interesting in the final synthesis to compare findings from the research on a conflict-trade relationship to findings from the same investigation in other conflict-prone regions, given that intra-regional trade is so very low. So perhaps, Ahmed, if you would like to respond to those three topics. And in the meantime, we'll be waiting for further questions or comments from the audience.
Katerina, I'll answer the first one. That there is some kind of background noise. I don't know, somebody's opening the mic or what, but I couldn't hear well the other two. So let me start by the first one, then maybe if you can kindly repeat the second one, I'll answer. Not including Bahrain, again, this is something that has to do with the data sets that have been used by the researchers, mainly Ibrahim Saif is his paper, and Katerina's paper didn't deal with such issues, but it's mainly Sekat and Marwani in this regard, and maybe it is the issue that they had missing data or the database did not include it, but it's not then done definitely by intention, but it's a matter of data availability. So I cannot really answer this on their behalf, but I assume that this has been the case. The second question was what, Katerina, please?
The second question was on the impact of black market on trade between the countries in the region.
Okay, this is an issue that definitely is an issue by itself. The informal trade flows and smuggling flows and trade trafficking as human trafficking that happens in the region. But again, that was out of the scope of the project. But maybe if there are data, and I doubt that there is any data, they can be included as control variables in this regard. But since there is no data, how can they be tested or included? But it can be maybe hinted that this is an issue if there is a literature that says that it is evident in the case of MENA.
Thank you. And the third question was regarding the possibility of including in the final synthesis a comparison of our findings on the relationship between conflict and trade to findings from other regions that are conflict prone, especially given that the intra-regional trade in the MENA is so very low. I mean, we do touch upon it in the first chapter where I did the literature review, but here the suggestion is to include this in the final synthesis.
I definitely, and that fits what Lahsan said as well when he mentioned about how the relationship between the literature review and what we found in the conclusions of MENA. But again, as I mentioned, the MENA results that empirically that have been reached by Sekat and Marwani on both sides are actually more or less insignificant in terms of the relationship both ways. So there is no benchmark to compare with. I mean, I cannot easily say, okay, in the case of MENA, there is no impact of conflict on trade. That's not very much the case. The Marwani showed there might be a slight difference, a slight effect, and Sekat showed the other way around, a small effect. So I cannot easily relate and say that this is the case or not the case as in the other regions. The only thing that we put that one of the Marwani's conclusions was more or less in line with the realists type of school of thought, and that we mentioned that it's not the case that economic interdependence lessen the probability of conflict. That's what has been reached, but so far it remains the main lessons learned that we still have to know much more about the control variables and much more about the definition of both conflict and economic interdependence to be able to reach concrete results. If I said that, okay, we are like this region or that region, I think I'll be doing a very big mistake in generalizing thing that is not very accurate and relating it to another region, which I'm sure 100% as well that whatever conclusions have been reached there did not use the narrow definitions of conflict prevention or escalation or solving or whatever, as you'd identified in the literature review, and they used another proxy for economic interdependence. So to benchmark or to compare, I'll be comparing apples to oranges and not apples to apples. That was my point of view.
Right, thank you so much. Since we have no other questions and we are actually running out of time, I will just conclude with what I should have started with. So my apologies again for being late and for the noise. I had to move to the hotel lobby. But I would like to conclude this very interesting section with a short introduction of our key speaker today, whom most of you probably know very well, but just to make the formalities, to tick off all the boxes. So Ahmed Ghonaim is a professor at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science in Cairo. He's also a research fellow for the Economic Research Forum for Arab Countries, Iran and Turkey, as well as for my institution, that is Center for Social and Economic Research in Poland. Ahmed is working as a consultant to several international and national organizations, including World Bank, WTO, UNDP, and many others. He's a doctor of economics, and his interests mostly focus on trade policies, trade services, and regional trade integration, as well as multilateral trading systems, the WTO, economics of intellectual property rights, institutional economics, law and economics, and political economy. And that's only to mention a very few fields in which he specializes in. Apart from doing research, he's been also advising to several governments on the trade policy issues. He's been helping to build programs in different countries and working throughout both the region and the EU, also as in a capacity of a diplomatic position as well. So thank you very much, Ahmed, for this presentation, for presenting the all the chapters and summarizing the findings of the research study. Thank you very much for everyone who contributed with questions. Thank you very much, Lahsen, again, for providing the feedback. And I believe that's all we have time for now, if I'm not mistaken, Shireen. So I'll just give back the floor to you, and many thanks once again to everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seedlow. Sorry. Go ahead.
Shireen, I just want to thank Catherine, and she was as well not only the chair lady of this session, but she is as the one who wrote the literature review paper, which was excellent in this regard. And again, I'm emphasizing, please, Ya Lahsen, send me your comments even by hand writing on a WhatsApp or email or whatever.
Will do, Ahmed. Will do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Seedlow, Dr. Ghonaim, Dr. Rashei. And with that, we move to our session 4 on regional experiences and lessons learned. Dr. Adil Malik will be our moderator. Dr. Armando Soto will be talking to us about the aftermath of Arab uprising, reconstruction, peace, and democratic change. And then our lead commentator is going to be Dr. Noha Mekawi. Dr. Adil, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, indeed.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much, Shireen, and to the Economic Research Forum for providing me the opportunity to moderate this very interesting session, which will focus on regional experiences and the broader lessons learned from them. We have an excellent speaker with us, Raimondo Soto, who's an associate professor of economics at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Sorry for my pronunciation if I haven't done it right, Raimondo. Raimondo is a very experienced researcher. He's obviously had a PhD in economics from Georgetown University and has published extensively in international journals on a range of macro issues, ranging from long-run growth, exchange rate misalignment, monetary policy, corruption, resource curse, institutions and labor markets. He's been a visiting scholar in several institutions in US, Europe, Latin America, and has worked extensively with international organizations, including the World Bank, IMF, IDB, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He was also the Director of International Development at the Dubai Economic Council, and he's also the managing editor of our Middle East Development Journal. We're also very pleased to welcome the discussant, who's Noha El-Mikawi, who until recently, for about much of last decade, was the regional representative and the director for the Ford Foundation. She is broadly interested in comparative politics and political economy, has a PhD in comparative politics from California, University of California at Los Angeles, and has extensive experience in a range of issues, has published widely including the most recent publication 2020 on From Risk to Opportunity, Local Governance in the Southern Mediterranean, which was published by Barcelona Center for International Affairs. So the setup is as follows. We'll have about 30 minutes reserved for Raimondo, followed by about 15 minutes of discussion by Noha, and then we'll open the floor for discussion another 10 minutes. If you speak for a shorter time, obviously this would mean more time for discussion as well. So Raimondo, over to you. Just 5 minutes before your session, before your allocated time finishes, I'm going to flag you, and alert you to finish in the next 5 minutes. So over to you, Raimondo.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? And
Perfect.
also, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Nice, good, excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me here. This is always a pleasure to be at the RF seminar. And this is a rather long project, extensive project that Samir Magdisi and myself are heading on the aftershock of the Arab Uprising, focusing on reconstruction, national peace, and democratic change. Around 15 researchers were writing papers for this project. A larger number of discussants help us to shape the product. We received superb ERF management and relentless support from Ford Foundation, which included guidance on where to look and what to assess. We had 2 workshops and several seminars of this, and the product of this project is coming in the form of a book, which is to be published by Routledge. The book is approved and ready, so we expect the book to be out very soon. And the project also led to a follow-up project on sustainable political economic transformation, which I'm going to discuss after this session in the form of a short panel. Now, the content of the book is very extensive. The book is around 400 pages. Apart from the introduction, the concluding note, there are 2 parts of the project. One is trying to assess post-conflict development and democratic governance. And here we look at the region in general. In particular, we focus also in the second part of the book on 4 country studies: Syria, which is perhaps one of the most dramatic examples of conflict in the region; Yemen, which is an example or an unfortunate example of sustained chronic conflict in the area. And then we also look at Libya and Iraq. Some of the writers of the papers are in this session, participating in this session, either as presenters of other research or as participants of the conference. And they actually did a tremendous work. So I'm going to try to summarize not only the lessons learned, but also the question that this research raises. And I hope to be fair with the authors of the papers, but it's a very difficult thing because it's a very long project, and I only have around 20 minutes to summarize it. So where do we start? What is the common ground where the paper started? And this is a summary of the work I did with Samir on the topic. We start from the notion that there is a failure of Arab countries to implement inclusive and participative democratic systems. And this is despite sustained economic development, although very uneven. What do we mean by democracy? Basically, a system of governance in which two conditions are met. One is that society can choose to replace those rulers through open, free, and fair elections. And the second one is that politicians are also held accountable for their action and policies. In a number of countries, we had, to some extent, not in the region, elections without accountability, and in a very few countries without accountability, without elections. But meeting the two is what we mean for a democratic system, and that is not available in the region. The Arab Spring, therefore, in our view, reflects the collapse of the social contract, a social contract that was largely based on trading political non-participation for goods, such as subsidies, which were pervasive and widespread in the region, and also public employment, guaranteed by public employment, most of the time at a wage which is unconnected with the effort done by the public employees to earn that salary. But that collapse of that social contract is actually a manifestation of an ongoing fundamental transformation of the socioeconomic and the political order in MENA, and that's one of the key issues that the papers, particularly the country studies, highlight. Furthermore, in Syria, in Libya, Yemen, and Iraq, the 4 country studies, the general consensus is that achieving a lasting national peace will be conditional on laying the foundations for such inclusive form of development, socioeconomic and political development, in the context of a genuinely democratic environment. It may not be achieved in the very short term or even in the short term, but it should be a goal for the medium and long run to have such a inclusive, participative, and also accountable political system. The design of this reconstruction agenda is a must, and the review of the experiences of the countries is that there is an imbalance between either the political or the economic elements, and either one or the other, or and sometimes both, become a limitation to success. So the idea of having a reconstruction agenda ought to consider both, that neither political nor economic elements become a limitation to success. And then in order to come up with an agenda for transformation and solid, and sustainable peace, the papers engage first in a solid and rather extensive diagnosis of the existing conditions and an assessment of the institutional and policies that led to the fracturing of the social contract. So this is basically what all the papers have done in the beginning, and the aim of the project and the book is identifying these conditions and indicating how to move away from such bad initial starting point for reconstruction. Now, in the initial paper, we look at Samit myself. We look at the causes of conflict and the challenges for reconstruction, and we identify several variables that have been previously identified also to be the cause of the discontent and the basis of conflict. Ahmed Nonem has gone through a lot of them, so I don't need to repeat them. One of the things that have been that showed up in the country studies is the role of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, as a precondition for conflict, in the sense that the higher the unemployment or underemployment or employment of poor quality that you have, then the alternative cost of violence lowers significantly, and therefore the probability of having a conflict increases as well. Second to unemployment is the issue of the deteriorating supply of public goods, both in terms of quantity, but most important in terms of quality, health, education, labor issues, and of course, housing. And then a second type of problem, which is more on not exactly on only economic terms, but also in terms of grievances that it creates, is the fact that a number of institutional and social factors played a role in generating the conflict. One is cronyism, corruption, abuse of power by public servants, and therefore there is a need to come up with a transformation agenda that not only deals with what economists we usually think of, but also what dimensions of which economists we're not always aware of that make a significant impact on the likelihood of having a conflict. So the challenges will be first to undertake political reforms of governance and for mitigating the risk of recurrence to violence, including instilling self-controls to different factions aiming at influencing the political outcomes, including also political generosity, intergroup confidence and trust, starting from a position where there is no confidence and no trust, and then the key issue of security and disarmament of the different participants of political life. Apart from minimum political reforms, you also need to jumpstart the economy to create jobs and incomes, particularly for the youth. And at the same time, and this is was discussed yesterday between in the previous presentations, this very complicated question that Noha Al-Mikawi raised yesterday is to what extent you need short-term measures typically to stabilize the economy and the like, and postpone or versus is there a trade-off with long-term deep economic reform? So jumpstarting the economy is crucial, but also reforms are crucial, and the balance between how much to effort and time allocate to each other becomes very, very difficult, and also depends on the initial conditions that each country has. And finally, the political support for reconstruction effort depends primarily on the population perceiving an improvement in their standards of living. If the improvement in the quality of life is not there, then any economic reform will be completely futile, and political reforms also. So the thematic papers, we have 3 thematic papers, one on the economic agenda, and which Samir and myself wrote, identifying the key economic, political, and social challenges and proposing policies. And our main takeaway from our paper is that reconstruction policies should be primarily geared toward changing, either improving or eliminating altogether, the pre-conflict institutional fabric of the country that created the conditions for failure. If you don't undertake that kind of reform, then the chances of a new failure increase dramatically. If reconstruction policies are to gain legitimacy and be sustainable, they should focus on achieving broader economic inclusion and lessening inequality. The lessons from the last 3 or 4 decades of development in MENA is that whilst economic conditions improved and in general income per capita grew relatively fast, economic inclusion did not, and inequality did not, and that led to political unrest. Unemployment plays or might play an important role in this. And the third one is that any economic and political reform that you suggest should be in the context of a new form of social contract, in which we aim at having a genuine democratic environment. The old social contract is no longer viable. The old social contract based on public employment subsidies being offered in an attempt to buy political stability is no longer going to be there for a number of reasons that the paper discusses. Then we also have a small addendum that the project started before COVID, and then we had to make any kind of references to COVID-19, and in the end, I will discuss very briefly what we have on that. Then there is a second thematic paper by Ana Bodea and Christian Howell on the key issue of whether these conflicts are grievances-based or greed-based, and they highlight the issue that whilst most of the literature has tilted towards economic-based explanations of the conflict, grievances are also very important and should be taken into account. So they test for the role of democratic political institution, exclusion, inequality, natural resources, and the like. And their conclusion, which is the main takeaway of the paper, I guess, is that it is not greed or grievances, but greed and grievances. And both are present to different degrees in the outbreak of violent civil conflicts in the region. Therefore, any post-conflict reconstruction must deal harmonically with both greed and grievance. Nick Sambanis has this very interesting paper in the project where he discusses whether power-sharing agreements can lead to peace building. And in particular, under what conditions can power-sharing institutions reduce the risk of war recurring? And by a power-sharing institution that is viable, Nick Sambanis asks the following question. Can this institution provide a mutually acceptable self-enforcing bargain that could avoid the highest cost of violence in adjudicating disputes over power? And what role for inclusive power-sharing institutions? And he separates between those that allocate power to the central government versus those that grant policy autonomy to territorially concentrated groups. So to what extent you have to centralize or decentralize power-sharing institutions in order to avoid war recurrence or conflict reignitions. And the main results is an empirical result based on a number of econometric works, is that only constrained power sharing has a positive effect on the probability of democratic survival, on the probability of a peace agreement to survive. And only inclusive power sharing produces positive outcomes for democratic stability. But the more extensive the inclusion of former rebels in power, in the power balance, the more it weakens the party's commitment to power sharing. So it's a very delicate balance between power sharing and, at the same time, inclusion of rebels in power. Okay, so the paper is not conclusive, but it warns us of the importance of being inclusive, but to a certain extent. Now, for the country studies, there are some common issues that reflect what is in there. There's a lot of analysis and a lot of heterogeneity in the conditions for conflict, in the evolution of conflict, in the outcome of the conflicts in these four countries: Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Libya. One of the things that come out of the four country studies, 7 papers but 4 country studies, is how to effectively support the replacement of a failed social contract. This is the collapse of the authoritarian bargain that these countries had, for a new, negotiated, inclusive, and representative social contract. So all the papers aim to deal with this issue. Second issue is, what shall we do when a power sharing agreement, such as that observed, for example, in Iraq and Yemen, fails? What do we do if these power agreements fail? What is plan B? Is there a plan B? We don't have any plan B. Is that the only, we all commit to one only an exclusive power sharing agreement, or do we have a plan B? Can countries retrace their path and say, well, let's go back to 10 years ago when we signed this and see if we can move forward out of that? Can we anticipate and avoid failure? Can escape clauses be credibly implemented? So we have an agreement, we're going to move out of the agreement, for example, because you have a negative shock. Can we go out and then come back? The third kind of topic, which is implicit in the paper, is what policies are desirable, which policies are feasible, is there a trade-off between feasible and desirable policies, how far can reforms go, and what is the acceptable minimum effort? And the fourth topic is, what role for external factors to support or hamper the emergency of a new social contract? So is there a role for regional or global powers to support or to block the emergence of a new social contract? What about international financial organizations? Can the exiled population be of some help, and the like? So the three papers on Syria, which were written by the authors, and you see there, we can call this perhaps summarizing the three papers as the collapse of the authoritarian bargain and the social contract under which citizens agree to give up political rights in exchange for public services. The system was characterized by lack or complete lack of power sharing and participation, which fueled grievances, ill-fated reforms prior to the Arab uprising, to the Syrian uprising. Ill-fated reforms led to chronism, and this led in turn to increase perceived inequality, lack of accountability, social unrest. Then when the turmoil started, the repressive response and discrimination against minorities was very harsh, and that led to civil war, and then international third parties played a very negative role. So out of the Syria three papers, it appears that negotiating a new social contract that embodies genuine power sharing is a necessity. But the nature of this, and the three papers to some extent discuss different angles for this idea. The nature of the peace settlement will to a very large extent will influence the probability that peace will last and that it will lead to a more democratic outcome. The second comment that is common for the three papers is that second best options for political economic reforms are most likely to be sustainable and effective. And here, none of the authors think that you might move immediately to long-term needed reforms, but you need a lot of second best options for the time being. The third one is that reconstruction will need significant financing that is way beyond the current means of the government, so that capital repatriation and domestic resource mobilization will be very crucial, and there is some discussion on which will be the source or the main source, and to what extent the timing of this availability of resources will be important. Now, the Yemen story is very different from Syria. The authors of this very interesting paper focus mainly on the failure of the power sharing agreement that was negotiated in the 90s. And one key question that comes out of the paper is, where is plan B when plan A fails? Where is plan B when the power sharing agreement that we envisioned did not work? So they focus first on highlighting the fact that an equal power sharing agreement negotiated in the 1990s did not work. And the proposal for a new agreement in 2013 was never implemented. Combination of the two, plus a lot of instability, tribalism, lack of strong central authority, and warlordism are at the root of the conflict. And the key question is, can we go back to the power sharing formula adopted in 2013 but never implemented? Can we go back to that? Is that a starting point for a new power sharing agreement that would lead to lasting peace? And the paper discusses the feasibility of this return to a power sharing formula. But they warn that in order to do that, you need to reform several issues, one of which is religious sectarianism. And the second is that it needs to recognize the fact that a lot of local groups have a very important role to play, and the authority of local groups cannot be ignored. The paper finishes with a rather optimistic view that if one returns to a power sharing agreement where you have some things and elements banned and another elements highlighted, you may have governance for future in the future for Yemen.
Hi, Raimundo, just 5 minutes.
Good, I'm almost done. The Libya case is an entirely different animal, because it basically focuses on the inability to reverse the progressive disintegration of the nation state. And since the uprising, Libya has suffered from all forms of instability, tribalism, ethnic divisions, foreign interventions, and these have reinforced one another. And compounding effects come from the fact that the country is oil-rich and therefore prone to foreign interventions in different ways. So again, following a little the Yemen case, the authors suggest that perhaps going back to the Shkirat agreement in 2015 might be a way to go out of this conflict if this power sharing agreement focused on inclusiveness and balance. And again, this is not feasible in the immediate future, and a transitional government is needed to bring together the warring parties. And therefore, you again go back to these second best short-term policies as opposed to long-term, perhaps first best policies, and the need to have a balance between the two and an agenda to move from short-term policies to long-term policies. Okay. Support from the international community in this case would greatly facilitate such a process. And finally, Iraq is a very interesting paper because it points to something that I think is very important. What is to be salvaged from the wreck, from the collapse of the system? What should we keep, and what should the country remove? And they focus on the de-Baathification of Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein, which from ideological reasons was basically wipe out the entire public sector from Ba'ath members, and which led to the adoption of an ethno-sectarian apportionment system between the Sunnis, the Shiites, and other groups. Now, this power sharing agreement failed and led to a state which was dismantled and paralyzed. and subsequent government were unable to improve matters. So reconstruction, even though the country has money and a lot of problems, yes, but even though the country has money, reconstruction has been slowed, not by the lack of resources, by state incapacity, by patronage, by corruption, and by institutions that are kept in disrepair, basically because you wipe out human capital from the government. So the state, according to this author, the state is a problem, and at the same time, the state is the solution. Only that the first state is not the second state. You need to change the state. You need to include and introduce a number of reforms so that it can become an agent of change. And the second issue coming from this paper, and there is a central role for the state in meeting this challenge, and this need not constrain the development of a private sector that is much needed in the country. My last comment on COVID. All the chapters included an analysis of the impact of COVID-19. Because the papers were written a couple of years ago, it's just the initial impact of COVID. It's not the long-term impact of COVID, which is covered in these papers and in the book. But COVID-19 at the time was seen as a hard blow to the prospect of peace and sustainable development because of the health issues, because of the economic downturn brought about when we started all these COVID control measures, because it disrupted the fiscal stance, and because it took a heavy toll on marginalized populations. At the time, we didn't know if the shock was permanent or transitory, and therefore we had to be quite careful. And nowadays, we think that the hard landing of developed economies is likely to have a second negative impact on the region, and therefore, at the same time, we saw, at that time we saw, and at this time we continue to see, the pandemic as an opportunity for much needed political, economic, and institutional reforms. Pandemics tend to raise support for central authorities in the short term. It has the risk of increasing power concentration, but it has the rosy side that it improves on governance, and that there is a potential for improving democratic institutions in the long run. So I basically run through a very long project with a lot of papers. The book is around 400 pages, so summarizing in 30 minutes is a very difficult task. And I will allow my co-author Samir Magdisi to answer all the questions and the comments from Noha and Nikawu, which I'm pretty sure are going to be very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raimundo. That was very much on time and extremely useful. Okay, before we open the floor for discussion, may I invite Dr. Noha Al-Mikawi to offer her comments as a discussant. Noha.
Thank you very much, Adil. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this session, and indeed in the conversation of the last 2 days. I'm extremely appreciative of all the hard work that went into making this project come to this very fruitful and successful conclusion. It's not an easy feat at all. I would like to focus my intervention on 5 observations and then end it with 3 forward-looking observations. Hopefully, they would be useful for ERF future plans working on conflict and reconstruction in the MENA region. Let me start first by saying there is something very special about focusing on the conflict countries of the MENA region. The content of what we've been hearing from this distinguished set of scholars that worked on this project are not specific to conflict countries in the region. If we talk about systemic long-term challenges related to inequality and related to trust and participation in the MENA region, these are not specific to the conflict countries of the region. These are very much common to all countries in the region, stable or fragile. But what makes this set of arguments about the importance of inclusive development and the importance of inclusive governance, what makes this so special is that the scholars are actually working on it from the perspective of very specific set of conditions that lead to violent conflict. And that violent conflict is sometimes perpetrated by state actors and sometimes by non-state actors. And that's what makes also the set of countries that have been chosen so particularly interesting and fascinating, because what all countries in this study share in common is some considerable level of violent conflict. In some countries, the state is the predominant actor driving that conflict, and in others, non-state actors are the dominant actor. In all of the countries, there is a very strong foreign intervention dimension, both regional and international. And only in some, oil plays a much stronger role than in others. So you may want to think of it as Iraq is Syria plus oil, Libya is Yemen plus oil. All of them have foreign intervention. Iraq and Syria have dominant state responsibility for the conflict. Libya and Yemen have very dominant non-state actors, and we can disagree on this typology, but what I'm trying to say is that the set of countries we're looking at has a lot of richness in coming up with very intriguing conclusions that we have been listening to in the past 2 days. What are my main observations, particularly coming out of Raimonda's excellent presentation? I would like to start by saying that the conflict countries of the MENA region have something very special to offer in terms of global relevance in the kinds of questions that you can pull out of this research. In other words, what I'm trying to say is this project is not only about the MENA region's conflict countries, although it should be focused on that. It's also providing some interesting questions of global relevance. And I would invite all of us to think primarily of Africa, so as not to make my statement daunting when I say global relevance. Africa alone, which is the natural geographic extension of at least part of the MENA region, and a continent of great interest to the Asian component of the MENA region, Africa is going into an increasing trend of conflict and non-democratic governance. And it's all driven by systemic inequalities, but also a very, very dismal economic future, given the level of debt that Africa is facing right now. So when I say that this project should single out some key questions of global relevance, I think this has a lot of potential, at least for the immediate geographic extension of part of MENA, but not only. And I think Nader Kabbani made that excellent point yesterday about generating globally relevant questions and hypotheses out of this project. The second observation I'd like to make is particularly about state-led and non-state-led conflict. And our region has good examples of both. It strikes me as a particularly potent distinction to make with respect to all of the policies of reconstruction that are being discussed in this set of papers, as well as the policy recommendations for future reconstruction. It makes a big difference whether the perpetrator of the conflict was a state actor or a non-state actor when you talk about reconstruction. By the same token, it makes a big difference whether the perpetrator is a state or a non-state actor when you talk about political settlements and about power sharing. And this is stuff that political scientists grapple with and struggle with when it comes to institutional building in a post-conflict reconstruction setting. That's why I was so much interested yesterday in the tension embedded in the double challenge of stabilization versus long-term inclusive reform. This is a double challenge because stabilization is needed to bring about some hope for populations living under conflict and to bring them some basic social services. And a lot of institutional and state responsibility and accountability hangs on that goal of stabilization. But as all of you have heard and said in your research, if you stop there, you're not really finishing the job and securing long-term peace. So the state versus non-state actor dichotomy is crucial, and those set of papers, in my humble opinion, still have a lot of untapped potential in looking in more detail into that difference and how it will implicate economic and political reform. My third observation is about the very interesting comments made throughout the country studies about the role of international actors for socio-economic development. And it is indeed one of the more interesting points to be made beyond foreign policy and diplomacy about how international actors actually do, inadvertently or otherwise, sometimes perpetuate conflict by choosing, for example, to concentrate their efforts for stabilization or reconstruction in one region and not another, or by bringing in one of the conflicting parties in the name of inclusion and giving them more power than others. So international actors and the role in stabilization and reconstruction is extremely important. And I think the set of excellent work done in this project can still bring out a lot more nuanced observations and recommendations on the role of international actors in socioeconomic reconstruction and reform. And I'm not here talking, as I said, about diplomacy or foreign policy. My fourth point is on a very important point made yesterday in the conversation. And again, it came out today in Raimonda's presentation, and that's data. And I'm saying this because it's very clear that the set of scholars in that project have worked very hard to use what data is available and to use it well and milk it very well. And some of the hypotheses as well as recommendations point to the need to develop a bit more data that is not available yet. And I would say that on this note, I move on to some of my future looking comments. ERF is a think tank and a platform and a network of scholars that has proven its value add in establishing data sets that are common good. And I think that would be an interesting place for ERF to consider a role to play in building up a specifically a conflict country specific data set for the MENA region that will also help the methodological rigor of working on conflict countries in the MENA region. My second forward-looking comment is on the distinction, not the distinction, but rather the very potent points made yesterday and today in Raimondo's presentation about political settlements and power sharing agreements. Again, here there is incredible untapped potential in linking political settlements and power sharing agreements to the actual typology that exists in our region. I remember Dr. Samir Makdisi yesterday said that the region can boast for having given bad name to some power sharing agreements. And though that sounds very cynical, yet it's true that it allows us as scholars to draw upon the experience of power sharing, particularly in Lebanon and now in Iraq, and link that to the other parameters that all of you have worked on, namely the prevalence or lack thereof of oil, the prevalence or lack thereof of international and regional intervention, and the types of perpetrators of the violent conflict. This links very much to the very problematic point about war economies and non-state actors or warlords, and how do you re-engage them or not, a point raised in some of the country papers, as Raimondo has said today. So power sharing and political settlements are key, and an untapped potential for interdisciplinary work between political science and economics that the MENA region can still work on, and that would be a place for ERF to do some work. My final comment is about foreign intervention.
Just 1 minute, if possible.
Sure, foreign intervention. In my humble opinion, we still talk about foreign intervention using the frameworks of yesterday. The global system is transforming under our feet and in front of our eyes tremendously. The UN and the so-called international community that we talk about in many of our papers about conflict in the region are no longer fit for purpose, and in many instances are becoming unhelpful in solving conflict. The US and Russia are having their own debacle, and China is coming in strongly. It would be good for ERF to start to think about the role of foreign intervention in conflict countries in the region with some of a futuristic perspective, and not only look at it from the perspective of what we had in the past. I will stop here, congratulating everyone for an excellent piece of work, and thank you for making me part of this journey. Back to you, Adil.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noha. These were extremely insightful and very comprehensive comments. Clearly, a lot of food for thought. Raimondo, with your permission, rather than responding immediately to Noha's comments, shall we take some questions from the floor, because we are short of time? And then I'll come back to you.
You are the boss.
Okay, thank you. So one question that's been asked here is that when we think about the role of interference or control of foreign actors, what's the role of regional actors like Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, etc., on the power balance and on the power sharing in fragile conflict affected Arab countries? And I think this is an important question, because when we think about the distinction between state and non-state actors, a lot of the non-state actors are supported by other big regional powers too. right? And so that sort of muddles the water a little bit. In terms of other questions, if Raimondo, you can take a note, and then I'll come back to you, wind up, is about corruption. Is a question from Amal Karaki about whether any of the papers discuss the impact of, sorry, not corruption, the impact of climate crisis on economy. So obviously, climate and conflict are quite interconnected, and also growth. What is the role of that? Amal also asked another question about why Lebanon is not included in one of the country studies. So maybe you could really respond to that, Raimondo.
I could, but I'd rather have Samir to discuss the topics, and maybe I can complement his thoughts on this. If Samir wants. If not, I'll go ahead.
Samir, you have to unmute yourself. Samir, you have to unmute yourself.
I would like to simply answer the question on why was Lebanon not included. And the reason is that actually we were focusing on the countries of the 2010 uprisings, and Lebanon's conflict preceded that a long time before. So the focus was on these 4 countries, the uprisings countries, where that took place, the conflict took place. That was one reason why Lebanon was not included. But we had it, in fact, we had it in mind. I do not, Raimondo, I think that you better answer the other questions that have been raised, because you made the presentation.
Okay, no problem. Let me first answer questions properly, and then the comments by Noha.
Samir, sorry for interrupting. Samir, can you mute yourself now, please? Yeah, go ahead, Raimondo.
Okay. The first issue of climate change, some of the papers, Syria is one of them, and Yemen is the other one. They do talk about climate change and how that could affect political stability, and whether this climate change or environmental conditions could be at the source of the problems, but they tend to assign a very little role to that. Then corruption is an issue that goes through all the papers, basically highlighting the fact, and I mentioned it in the presentation, that the environmental the business environment and the links between the private sector and the public sector become very fuzzy if you have corruption, and therefore cronyism is likely to appear in most of the countries. It's highlighted in the case of Syria, but it's also elsewhere in a prominent role. So I would say that these 2 questions, one on climate change and corruption, are addressed in the country studies, and to some extent also in the main thematic papers. Now, the key issue of foreign versus regional actors, I would say it's fair. I would say that it is fair to say that we had it in the discussion, but we didn't have it in the analysis, which is a very different thing. So it's mentioned, it is discussed, but it's not treated as Noha said. It's not included as a key issue in the discussion. So we have an issue with either Saudi Arabia or Iran or whoever, or Israel and Turkey and the like. It all shows up in the papers, but it's not a key component in the analysis, and the papers would benefit from including this in a more systematic way. Now, some of the papers do have it. Syria, for example, is one case where foreign actors and regional actors have played a significant role. but it should be included more explicitly in the analysis. Now, let me go back to the actually 6 comments by Noah, not 5, if I'm not mistaken. I would take out the issue of data availability. Of course, the situation is really very bad in the conflict countries, and ERF has done a fantastic work on that. But yesterday we have this paper by Tillman Brooks saying that, indicating that it is possible to raise information even from conflict countries with reasonable risk, and therefore that availability may be an issue, but it's no longer really very important. Now, the other 5 comments are really very tough. I'm gonna make the work here. No. The issue of state and non-state led conflict is a very important one, and it hinges crucially on what type of institutions. First, what type of peace agreement or peace arrangement or power sharing arrangement you have, and the second one is what institutions you need to build up afterwards. And it's a very complicated one. On one hand, you would like to avoid state-led violence, but on the other hand, we cannot neglect the power of the government to inflict violence on other groups. And that is a very difficult balancing act between recognizing the fact that the state is big and it's powerful and the like, and recognizing also that you cannot leave the government out of the political agreement. It's not going to work. So that's one key issue. I don't know to what extent the project is able to discuss that, but I'm happy that the reading of the papers lead to that kind of observation, that we need to work more on that. And this is an issue for this is an issue for the second half of the project, which includes 1 paper by Adil and another 2 papers I'm going to discuss in the next session. So that's one key issue that I think is a very, very good point. The other thing that you mentioned, which is important, I think, well, all that you mentioned is important, but is a fact that maybe the typologies which we are using to think of the problems of conflict in the region should be challenged, and that you need to change the way in which you see, for example, power sharing agreements. Are power sharing agreements really the way we look at them? Out of the project, it comes that the Yemen power sharing agreement didn't work, and it's a warning that maybe and in Iraq it didn't work. Maybe it's not a good idea to have this sort of agreement as a way out of conflict. But on the other hand, it might be that we're wrongly implemented or poorly designed in the beginning. That comes out of the Iraq issue, and it also comes out of the Yemen issue case, because in both cases you have a power sharing agreement that was ill-designed and proved to be ill-designed down the road.
I'm under 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay. I'll finish now. So is it that power sharing agreements per se don't work in the long run? Is it that the design is crucial and that challenges their survival, or is it that we allow the consensus built to generate these power agreements to erode over time? And even if the agreement was okay, and even the participants were there, maybe changing the conditions, changes in the conditions or changes in the commitment led to the collapse of them. Those are very, very interesting issues, and I will stop here.
All right, thank you very much. Well, all that remains for me is to really thank Raimondo for this excellent presentation and to Noha for our very insightful comments and to everyone who participated in this session. My one-liner really is relates to what Noha you talked about and what the way you referred to Nadir's comment about, how can we do globally relevant scholarship? And it seems to me that this interaction between domestic factors and international factors in the production of conflict and the sustenance of it, etc., is a really important one. And in a way, the Middle East, unfortunately, is the best laboratory to test those ideas. And if you look at global scholarship, whether it's in political economy, whether it's on conflict and development, it understates the role of external factors. And in a way, a lot of the research that is supported by the ERF can really produce locally relevant, locally produced perspectives about that issue, which is addressed very insufficiently and in a very inadequate fashion in the global literature. And there's clearly politics of knowledge about it, because if you were to address it head on, it would be very uncomfortable for a lot of dominant discourses that we have in Western academia and policy circles. With that, I would close the session and thank everyone for participating. We will proceed immediately to the closing session, and therefore I will hand over the session to Shireen. I think the next moderator is Samir. So Shireen, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Malik. Thank you, Dr. Raimondo Soto and Dr. Noha Mekawi for a very exciting session. I think we now move to the closing session with Dr. Samir Maqdisi as a moderator and Dr. Raimondo Soto, Dr. Shahir Zaki as well. Unfortunately, Dr. Santa Devarajan could not be with us. We received an apology just shortly. He could not make it. So with that, I give the floor back to Dr. Samir Maqdisi for the closing session. Dr. Samir?
You're mute, Samir.
Okay. Thank you, Shireen. I must say I was extremely impressed by the presentation in this session and by the discussions. Very, very, very helpful indeed, and lots to think about as a result of the commentaries that we made. Now, this in closing, what now we are doing is to sort of get a final move to this project we have been engaged in for the last 5 years. We've diagnosed the deficits, we've diagnosed the backwardness of the world. Why is it an autocratic environment? Why is there uncertain economic growth? Why is it there is highly unequal income distribution? Well, how do we move on? The question, what's the next step? How do you move on into an Arab world that's not at the bottom of the list? If you look at the data, at the bottom of the list of countries, to a more sustainable economic growth, to greater equality, both political as well as social. And this is really the purpose of the new project, which we have called it's called now here Project on Sustained Political and Economic Transformation. And I'm really Raimondo and I are managing this project, and we are very, very fortunate, in fact, that we have had the collaboration, we're able to get the collaboration of 4 distinguished economists, Shanta Devarajan, Roberta Gatti, Adil Malik, and Shahir Zaki. We're very happy they have been able to join us in order to complete the project. It includes 3 papers. The first, A New Social Contract for Post-Conflict MENA, which is authored by Shanta and Roberta. The second is Political Economy of Post-Conflict Reforms in Arab Societies by Adil and Shahir. And the third presents a model that identifies the path to national peace and democracy by Raimondo, along with myself and the assistant Professor Zan Amin. Now, these papers hopefully will be completed, the drafts will be completed by midsummer, I hope. and we'll take it from there and try to finish this new book. I'm sorry that Shanta could not be with us, and therefore I will immediately invite Raimondo to be followed by Shahir to give his comments. Go ahead, please, Raimondo.
Raimondo, you're on mute. Still on mute.
Now you can hear me?
Yeah.
Now we can hear you.
Oh, good. Thank you, Sam. You mentioned that. What I was saying is that this project links with the previous one. We would like to move forward, and as Samir said, we have one paper dealing with new social contracts, another one with new reforms, and our section with Samir and Razan would like to do two things. One is to have a theoretical model that would guide us on the empirical part to trying to understand what ignites a social conflict, violent conflict, or what makes a peace agreement to fail, which is the reverse of the coin. So let me show you what we're doing. This is also all very preliminary, and all kinds of comments are more than welcome. So our paper would link with Shanta's and Roberta's on political post-conflict governance, and with Adil and Shahir on the connection between political economic issues in post-conflict. So basically what we do is the following. We're trying to model Arab uprisings as a guide to national peace, not only for understanding what makes these uprisings occur, but also on national peace. And the contribution are the following. We were able to come up with a theory of the uprisings as a result of both economic determinants, so there is a greed motive, as well as political and sociological issues, grievances, which are to some extent in the previous literature. But the nice aspect of this theory is that it provides testable implications regarding the role of economic conditions, for example, unemployment, the fact that you have resource rents, terms of trade shocks, business cycles, and the like. Also on sociological and political elements such as polarization, political participation, accountability, and a little on the mechanics of power control. So how to use information and where noise comes in affecting political support for the incumbent. And the model, I'm not going to even start discussing the model, is based on a game between the incumbent and the citizens, whereby the incumbent offers a bargain.
تحدثنا أيضا قليلا عن ميكانيكيات السيطرة.
I think we have a problem with the translation. I can hear it over Raimondo's speech.
No problem. And then the citizens take this offer, which include transfers and ideological groups, and evaluate whether to accept, in which you have a peace scenario, or to rebel, in which you have a conflict scenario. Now, overthrowing the government entails unexpected gains for the citizens. This is the carrot. But failing entails a massive loss. This is the stick. And the fact that you always pay the cost of the conflict makes the decision more complicated. And what we model in the end is the probability of rebelling, which in our model is endogenous. It's not an external thing. And it depends on the offered bargain. And what makes it really nice is that we have asymmetric information in the model and the presence of exogenous shock. So the theory is, to our understanding and to our in our evaluation, quite ambitious. Now we have an econometric section of this, where we study the determinants of the probability of an uprising. And here our contributions are as follows. Conflicts are dynamic phenomena, and therefore starting points are important. Conflict begets conflict. Then we also have asymmetric adjustment. So transiting from peace to conflict may be very different than moving from conflict to peace. Then we have the issue of long memories. Sociological, political, and economic issues have a lot of memory. Therefore, dynamics are important, and starting conditions, as I said, are important. Then we have idiosyncratic characteristics, some of which are not observable, and a lot of endogeneity. So what we're doing is we rely on panel data so that we can pull the experience of several countries and several time periods in a dynamic context, while allowing for an observable country characteristic. This will lead us to using dynamic panel data, probit models with unobserved heterogeneity. We have 125 countries, 30 years, over 3,000 observations. We exclude all developed economies, so this is a model for emerging economies. And we model two things: failed peace agreements and civil wars. For civil wars, we have a customary definition. For peace agreements and failed peace agreements, we have an ad hoc definition, which is the resumption of a conflict after, say, 5 years of a peace accord. And what we would like to do is to measure the change in the probability of a conflict as due to changes in determinants. And only to pique your interest in our project, this is an example of what we would like to measure. We have included in the analysis which is the origin of your legal system. And we have a socialist legal system or non-socialist legal origin. And the transitions from peace to conflict and from conflict to peace are very different according to these two systems. For example, there is a 91.3% chance of moving from peace to conflict if you have a socialist legal origin, and only 3% if you have a non-socialist legal origin. Staying in conflict is very high, 98% in a socialist system, and it's only 60% in a non-socialist legal system. And moving from conflict to peace is very low in a socialist system, and is not very low, 40% in a non-socialist legal system. So this is only to pique your interest. This is not going to be part of the measurements that we will have. This is just to make an issue here. But this is a type of exercise we would like to do. How much peace you, quote unquote, buy if you have a more democratic system, if you have checks and balances in the government, if you have different dimensions of sociological situations, for example, ethnic polarization, religious polarization, and the like. What's the role of unemployment in inducing higher chances of moving from peace to conflict or from conflict to peace? So based on that, we think we will guide our analysis of what brings about conflict in the region, and most important, what makes peace agreement fail in the region. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Raimundo. That was very concise, precise, and to the point. Ali, Shahir.
Thank you, Dr. Samir. The second paper with Adil, the main idea of this paper is to look at the post-conflict economic reforms that we can have, and I'll just present some ideas that we're currently working on, and perhaps Adil, you can jump in to add some insights as well. So we're mainly focusing on two main dimensions in the paper, or two main axes. The first one will be the political economy behind the reforms on the one hand, and on the other, what kind of economic reforms that we need. And when we talk about the political economy of reforms, we just had, first a discussion on how to classify the countries. And I think we already had this discussion yesterday, because we have countries that are perhaps that are not abundant in natural resources, and this can affect their fiscal space or their dependency on foreign aid. Countries that might be more fractionalized in terms of ethnic or ideological divisions, and all this will determine the choice of economic policies and the new political institutions that will be associated to these reforms. So the first part, which is mainly the political economy of reforms, two main ideas we were mainly focusing on. First, what kind of what will determine the transition from conflict to post-conflict? To what extent different actors and thus new coalitions, the new social coalitions, can help implement those economic reforms, and how this political economy also can help creating a credible commitment for the growth agenda, and to increase also the legitimacy of the government. So that's the political economy side. And clearly, one important thing in this part was the fact that good institutions do not necessarily mean just voting, because it's much broader than that, and institutions have to be much more inclusive than just the right to vote or the democracy in its classical or straightforward term. And then the second part of the paper will mainly focus on the types of economic reforms that are needed in post-conflict periods. And I already presented this briefly yesterday, this trade-off or the arbitrage that we have between short-term stabilization policies that are needed in order to rectify different macro imbalances or to generate growth in the medium term, in the short term, versus longer policies that target more the longer term in terms of the market structure, the political economy of trade policy, the political economy of industrial policy, and so on. So clearly, given the importance and the necessity of having short-term policies, but just focusing on such policies can lead to a time inconsistency, given that we might deviate from the long-term objective. So clearly, what we'll be trying to work on in this part is to compare MENA countries with other countries that experienced such a transition from conflict to post-conflict, and to see how this trade-off between stabilization, short-term policies versus more structural and deeper reforms that help rectify the original causes of conflicts. Perhaps I can stop here, and Adil, if you want to add something to the political economy part.
Adil? Is he not with us?
Perhaps.
Adil, what are you doing?
Perhaps he had connection problems.
Shireen?
I don't know. Dr. Malik's camera is off and he's on mute, so we're not unable to tell.
Well,
I mean, in all cases, I presented just the main ideas of our paper, and then we'll be happy to have your feedback and comments to further improve. Thank you, Dr.
Right.
Sami.
Thank you very much, Shahir. I do invite questions and commentary from the audience. So anyone who has a question or comment, please go ahead.
I would like to say something, Samir.
Yeah, go ahead, Rahman.
Since we're managing the project, the third paper that Shanta is writing with Roberta Gatti, and both are not here now, deals with how to switch from the old social contract that is no longer viable in the region, to new ones. And they have a proposal for what is going to be the role of the government in building up the stepping stones for a new social contract. I think this is an extremely important aspect of the project because it deals with exactly what it deals with, putting into one umbrella both political, economic, and sociological issues that are the long-term goal of the transformation of in the region. What is going to be the new social contract that would last, let's say, 30, 40, maybe 50 years, and will guide the transformation. So it's a very important paper, and we're very pleased to have it in our on our project. It's a pity that Shanta
is not here. Yeah.
But it's a very interesting piece also.
Thank you, Raimundo. I don't know whether Adil is back or not. Apparently, Shahir, is he in touch with you at all? No, he's not. Well, are there any further questions that are to be asked? Do you have anything to add, Shahir?
No, thank you, Dr. Samir. I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay. And then in that case, I think we can come to a close. Shireen,
yes.
Is there something you'd like to say before we close?
No, I would just like.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, well, I mean, I really would like to thank you for the tremendous work you've done, and thank ERF for this organization of these 2 days, in which they have been extremely useful, extremely exciting, and they will help us a lot in moving forward. So please do convey our very, very special thanks to ERF and to you especially, Shireen. Many, many thanks for everything you have done.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Samir. Thank each and everyone who took part in the 2 days, last 2 days. It's been really, really rich discussions. And I was just telling my colleagues how it's always a delight to actually always end on a forward-looking note. So bringing this policy conference to a close, looking forward to 3 new pieces of work that promise to be very insightful is something we're all looking forward to. And we look forward to this work when completed, and to inviting all the participants who joined us over the last couple of days to be part of this discussion as well. Ever so grateful, and thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Shireen.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
a lot.